The Discovery of the Planets. Hi, this is Stephan, author of In Search of the Sublime. You can read the book for free on worldhistorybook.com. Let's start. In an attempt to understand the will of the gods, the priests of Mesopotamia, in modern-day Iraq, began to study the stars. As a result, they became the first professional astronomers. As observatories, they used temples on top of pyramid-like structures, called ziggurats. The first ziggurats date all the way back to the 4th millennium BC, predating the Egyptian pyramids by perhaps 1,000 years. An early example is the Anu ziggurat of Uruk, of which only the ruins remain today. It was dedicated to Anu, the god of heaven. And here we see what remains of that ziggurat today. Those ziggurats were conceptualized as mountains that could connect heaven and earth. We know this because some ziggurats were literally referred to as Duranki, or the bond between heaven An and earth Ki. The most famous ziggurat was built in Ur during the reign of King Ur-Nammu in the 21st century BC. The first level of the ziggurat still stands to this day, although it was restored in the 6th century BC. In its original state, the entire structure is estimated to have had a height of around 30 meters. And here we see what remains of the ziggurat of Ur today. Even with only the first level standing, it's still a magnificent sight. In the past, every ziggurat was topped by a temple. None of these temples remain to this day, but we know this from descriptions. The top of the ziggurat was also ideal for astronomical observations, since it gave an unobstructed view of the sky. From here, a team of Sumerian priests, the Sumerians, by the way, were the first civilization of Mesopotamia, or in fact the world, maintained an unbroken watch of the night sky. We see the Mesopotamian interest in the stars everywhere in their art. They were obsessed by it, as we shall see many times during this lecture. Here, for instance, we see a cylinder seal impression. To the right, we see a cylinder that you can rub along clay to make this impression. Depicted, we see the heroes Gilgamesh and Enkidu slaying the monster Chumbaba. But the reason I show this impression is because of the little symbols at the top. We see the crescent moon. The closer you get to the equator, by the way, the more the crescent appears on the bottom or the top. And next to it, we see 7 stars. They're called the Pleiades, and you might have seen them at night. Here we see a picture of the night sky. To the left, we see the constellation of Orion. We see those 3 stars in a row. They are the belt of Orion. Right of Orion, we see Taurus. And the bright star that's mostly visible is the eye of the bull, the eye of Taurus. And to the right of Taurus, we see 7, or in fact many more stars, but 7 clearly visible stars that are encircled. They're called the Pleiades. It's a very recognizable part of the night sky. Now let's trace what the Sumerian priests discovered while studying the heavens. First, they grouped stars into constellations. And many of the constellations that are still in use today go back to this early period. Here, for instance, we have the constellation Gemini, or twins. The 2 brightest stars of this constellation are seen on the left. They're the head of the twins, called Castor and Pollux in Greek. Next came the realization that the constellations change position during the year. It takes them 1 year to circle around. This was documented, for instance, on star charts, such as the one depicted here. Described on this chart were the stars that appear every month on the horizon. The priests also discovered that the moon and the sun passed through the 12 constellations known as the Zodiac. Here we see the moon, for instance, in its orbit. It's now at this position between Gemini and Taurus. Today we understand that the Sun, the Moon and the planets, as seen from the Earth, move through the zodiac because the zodiac is the plane of our solar system. Everything orbits the Sun in our solar system in the same plane, and the constellations of the zodiac happen to be around this plane. Strangely, the zodiac is also inclined at an angle of 23.5 degrees compared to the equator of the Earth. Today, we know this is caused by the tilt of the Earth in relation to the plane of the solar system. So in fact, it is us that is rotated at this angle and not the zodiac or the plane of the solar system itself. It is possible that some of the zodiac constellations go back all the way to 3200 BC, because at this point we start to see depictions that would later be associated with the zodiac, although we have those depictions without descriptions, so we cannot be sure. Let's examine the evidence. Let's take, for instance, a cylinder seal impression from about 2500 BC. We see the impression on the left, which is redrawn on this slide. The two arrows in this image point to the Sun, the Moon and Venus, which is often depicted as a 6 or an 8-pointed star. So this is suggestive that it has something to do with astronomy. But there's more. On the upper left side, we see a hunter with a bow aiming at a horned animal. This is a scene we would later recognize as Sagittarius and Capricorn. An archer hunting a goat or a stag or something like that. In the middle, we see also the scorpion, and below that also the lion and the bull, famous constellations. And on the top half, just a bit to the left, we see a goddess standing on a lion with what we believe to be weapons on her shoulders. This is the goddess Inanna, who would later be associated with Venus and is often depicted in this manner. So although we are not sure, this might be one of the earliest depictions of a lot of constellations. The same reasoning goes for the famous Seal of Adda from 2300 BC. Here we see again the Venus goddess Inanna, again with weapons on her back. And at the bottom in the middle, we see the sun god Shamash with sun rays coming from his shoulders. And we see him rising from the horizon. It's the rising sun. We also see here from left to right the lion, a hunting god, an eagle, and to the right we see Enki, a very important god who is shown with water streaming from his shoulders, water and fish. This is an image that we would later recognize as Aquarius. On this copy of a boundary stone from about 1200 BC, the link with the constellation is obvious. So here we are sure about the evidence. Here we see, you might have to pause to find all the images, we see the scorpion, the lion, the serpent, the eagle, and the goatfish. Somehow I missed till very recently that Capricorn isn't a goat, but actually a goatfish. Quite a curious character, and we already find that in the Mesopotamian artworks. In the image we also see, by the way, the moon, the sun, Venus. We see Jupiter, which is depicted as a spade. The main attribute of the god Marduk was associated with Jupiter. And we see Mercury depicted as a wedge. A wedge is an impression used to write cuneiform. We also see Mars somewhere at the top, depicted as a panther. In an astronomical text from about the same period called the Mul Apin, we find a complete list of the Mesopotamian zodiac. It also correctly states that the moon passes through all these constellations every lunar month. We read in this text, "The gods who stand in the path of the moon, through whose region the moon in the course of a month passes and whom he touches. They are the Pleiades, that group of 7 stars we discussed before, the bull of heaven or Taurus, the shepherd of heaven or Orion, the old man Perseus, the crook, the twins, the crab, the lion, all the famous constellations we still recognize today." And we continue, the furrow, which in the same text was also associated with a grain goddess and who later turned into Virgo. We see the scales, the scorpion, a strange figure named Pabelsak, which became Sagittarius. We see the goatfish, or Capricorn, A figure known as the Great One, now known as Aquarius, the tail of the swallow. That one disappeared in time and became the fish in the late Babylonian era, and the hired man, which later became Aries. A much later set of tablets from about 200 BC, called the Seleucid Zodiac, also beautifully shows some constellations next to the planets Jupiter and Mercury. We find Hydra, Leo, Corvus, the Crow, and also Virgo. We see a drawing of these two tablets below. The two stars here are planets, and from the left to right we see the serpent, the lion, the eagle, and to the right we see the Virgin. Unfortunately, the two parts of the zodiac are in two different museums. We have here the photographs from those two different musea. Next came the discovery of special stars which wander from one constellation to the next. The Greeks would later call them planets, meaning wanderers. And here, for instance, we see the planet Venus moving into the twin constellation. And in this way, the planets move from one constellation to the next. That is in fact how you can differentiate between the planets and the stars. The stars stay in fixed configurations, while the planets move from one constellation to the next. Mesmerized by the discovery of the planets, the Sumerians often depicted them in their art. Venus was often symbolized, we've seen it before, as an 8-pointed star, the moon by the crescent, and the sun, for instance, by an equal-armed cross. Here we see, for instance, Venus, the moon, and the sun in a row. And here we see from left to right the sun depicted with wings. We see Venus as the 8-pointed star, the crescent moon, and to the right we see that 7-star system again, the Pleiades. And here we see a hero shooting an arrow among stars. Again we see the Pleiades, and again the moon. A very beautiful image. And this is an impression I made myself. This is one of these cylinders. There are very many of them because they're made from stone. They last a long time, so they're quite inexpensive. And I made this in a piece of clay in my garden. Again, we see Venus and the moon underneath. And the hunting scene might actually again be Sagittarius and Capricorn. In various cases, we also see kings depicted wearing the symbol of the sun around their neck, demonstrating their connection to this divine sphere. And that's actually the inspiration behind my necklace right here. And here we see a close-up of that king. We see the symbol around his neck, and above his hand we see in order Venus, those tweezers, they are thunder. We see the moon, we see the winged sun, and then we see the crown of the sky god. Clearly the kings wanted to associate themselves with the divine heavenly orbs. The earliest references to the planets go all the way back to the 3rd millennium BC. At the time, they already appear in what seems to be horoscopes. For instance, we have a fragment from about 2000 BC. We read, "When the planet Jupiter turns his face when rising towards the west, and you can see the face of the sky, and no wind blows, there will be famine and disaster will rule." By studying the motions of the planets, the Mesopotamians believed they could read the will of the gods. As a result, they called the night sky the Book of Heaven. And the astronomer priests were set the task of reading this book to figure out how to best serve the gods in order to receive their praise and avoid their anger. That was their main goal of their astronomy. When the Babylonians finally took over Mesopotamia, astronomical research only intensified. Around the 7th century BC, the famous Venus tablet of Amisaduqa, the world's oldest known astronomical text, was written. And here we see a beautiful image of that tablet. The text gives a systematic compilation of omens or horoscopes drawn from the dates on which Venus first and last appeared above the horizon over a period of 21 years. The text also contains various divinations about floods, about the availability of food, the outcome of wars, and so on. Again, the point of these observations was to understand the will of the gods, what the gods had planned for mankind. The greatest source of astronomical knowledge from Mesopotamia was found in the remains of the royal library of Nineveh, where a staggering 30,000 tablets on various topics were discovered. And here we see a small, tiny part of that huge collection in the British Museum. A beautiful sight. This library was founded by the Assyrian philosopher king Ashur-Banipal in the 7th century BC. He had ordered his servants to collect texts from all around Mesopotamia for this library. We read, quote, "The rare tablets on your route that are not found in Assyria, seek them out and bring them to me." Ashur-Banipal's library contained a copy of the Anuma Anu Enlil, which was originally composed at some point in the 2nd millennium BC. And it contained about 7,000 omens written on 70 tablets, based on observations of eclipses, the phases of the moon, and also the positions of the stars, the sun, the moons, and the planets, and so on. A very comprehensive document. In time, it also came to be believed that each planet was animated by a god. Venus, for instance, became associated with the goddess Inanna, the goddess of war, fertility, and love. The sun was associated with the god Shamash, who ruled over heaven and earth. The moon became equated with the god Sin. This god was associated with the bull, perhaps because the crescent moon resembles the horns of the bull. Mars was associated with Nergal, the lord of the dead. Mars was often related to invasion, plague, and disease, possibly because of its red color. Jupiter was related to Marduk, the famous god Marduk, and he was sometimes depicted as a spade. This planet signified good harvest, peace, and security in most cases. One of the main tasks of the celestial gods was to decide the fate of the country, which they wrote down on a magical clay tablet called the Tablet of Destinies. As long as the supreme god Enlil controlled the tablets, the Mesopotamians believed, he made sure that the universe was in order. Various planets became associated with this Tablet of Destinies. Saturn was equated with the hero Ninurta, whose symbol was the eagle and who was believed to be the guardian of the tablet. Mercury was associated with the god Nabu, the god of the scribes, and as a result, the symbol of Mercury became that cuneiform wedge. When the gods assembled each year to decide the fate of the world, it was this Nabu god who recorded the fate on the tablet. Nabu was also considered to be the messenger of the gods, similar to the Roman god Mercury later. This is likely because of the rapid motion of the planet. Mercury is the fastest of all planets. As time went by, the astronomical knowledge of the Mesopotamians became more and more impressive. One of the most important texts in that library of Nineveh is the Mul Apin. We shortly discussed it before. It was probably created around the turn of the 1st millennium BC. It consists of 2 tablets that contain a summation of all astronomical knowledge that was available at the time. By this point, astrologers had roughly figured out how long the planets appear above and below the horizon in a number of days, thus allowing them to roughly predict their future positions. The text also explicitly speaks of the path of the moon, that's the quote we've discussed before. And the text then goes on to explain that the sun and the other planets move along this path as well. We can clearly see this in the image on the right. Here we see 4 planets clearly aligned, and the sun and the moon also move along this line. We now call this plane the ecliptic. We now know the ecliptic to be the plane of the solar system in which all the planets and the sun and the moon all move, as we've discussed before. Around 500 BC, things get even more impressive. At that time, the Neo-Babylonians discovered that 235 lunar months are about identical to 90 solar years. If we divide 19 by 235, we find the lunar month only seconds apart from the modern value. Quite impressive indeed. Around the same time, the Babylonians also discovered the so-called Saros cycle of 223 lunar months, or about 18 years, after which the Sun, the Earth and the Moon return to roughly the same configuration. As a result, chances are high that eclipses recur after this interval. This was seen as very important because an eclipse of the Sun was seen as an important and dangerous message from the gods. It was perceived as a direct attack by the gods on the king. And for the king to stay safe, he had to be replaced by a temporary substitute who was then sacrificed. We read, Damki, who had ruled Assyria, Babylonia and all the countries, died with his queen as a substitute for the king. He went to his destiny for their rescue. We prepared the burial chamber. He and his queen have been decorated, treated, displayed, buried and wailed over. The burnt offerings has been burned, all omens have been cancelled, and the numerous rituals, ceremonies, rites, chants, and recitations have been performed in the perfect manner. In this way the king had hoped to avoid his own death. The Persians, who became dominant in Mesopotamia from the 6th century BC, are credited with the discovery of the synodic and the sidereal periods of the planets. Let's distinguish these two, it's not that complicated. The synodic period is the time between consecutive conjunctions of the planet with the Sun. So, in normal language, how long it takes for the planet to orbit around until it returns to the position of the Sun, as seen from the Earth. The sidereal period is the time that it takes for a planet to pass through the entire zodiac. For instance, the Persians found that Saturn had a sidereal period of 29.5 years, and 2 of those sidereal periods were equal to about 57 synodic periods. So they had very accurate measurements at the time. Since the purpose of the Mesopotamian astrologers had always been to read the will of the gods, there was little motivation to go beyond a mere description of the motion of the planets. For the Greeks, however, this would be no longer enough. They wanted a rational mechanism to explain why the planets moved the way they did. But that is a topic for another time. So that was it for today. I hope you've learned a lot. If you want to know more about this topic, read my chapter in the book In Search of the Sublime. You can read it for free on worldhistorybook.com. See you there.